At the end of August of this year, in one of the lawsuits regarding Ramsey Solutions, also known as the Lampo Group, lawyers for Ramsey Solutions filed over 1,000 pages of documents. This included transcripts of depositions from Dave Ramsey and board members, as well as copies of emails they had sent. I recently had a conversation with lawyer and my good friend Melissa J. Hogan, and I asked her if she would help us better understand what is happening with these lawsuits involving Ramsey Solutions.
And anytime I look at these cases, I go back to a lot to John 3:20, which is, "For everyone who does evil hates the light and avoids it, so that his deeds may not be exposed."
Mm.
And, it just reminds me that we should all be living in a way that if a camera was following us around 24 hours a day, that our goal is to be able to stand by whatever we've said or
Yeah.
done.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't mean we're perfect. Of course, if a camera were actually following us, it would, we screw up. We
Yeah.
we mess up, but our goal is to live in such a way that whatever we have done or said could be exposed by a
Yeah.
camera, and that we're consistent, that who we are, who that camera captures in a secret meeting of the board is the same person that camera would capture at home
Yeah.
or out to dinner with friends or at church on Sunday.
Yeah. Yeah. So you have it's not that you have special access to information about these cases. It's that not everybody knows where to look. This is information that is publicly available that we are talking about. It's not something that you only had because you are a lawyer. There have been filings and attachments in the lawsuits related to Ramsey, and we're going to just kind of give people an update on what's still ongoing and where we are with those. And then we're going to talk a little more deeply about some of the things that we've learned from the filings.
Right. And, I'm really passionate about people having access to justice. And one of the ways we have access to justice is to be able to access legal filings and understand why courts do what they do and what's happening so that we can have confidence in the judicial system, and not just for lawyers. So, yes, anybody could access this information. But I will say the things we're going to talk about are obviously filings that people could access publicly. But I do have, as you know, private
Yeah.
information and private documents and recordings.
Yeah.
And
So as the things refer to you and your life, you do have some personal knowledge. So you're
right.
coming at this from your interest as a lawyer, interest in justice and light shining in the darkness, and that this has one of these cases has significant overlap with you. Well, one,
Two.
maybe two. Yeah. Two
Yeah.
have overlap with your life and your personal experience.
Yeah.
So what's still happening? What is ongoing?
All right. So at this point, we only have 3 active cases that we could put our hands on. And I just did a quick perusal. And, as an attorney, sometimes I really like being able to use my experience and my education to look at something and, help people understand it better. So the 3 outstanding cases right now are 2 cases in federal court, which is the Amos case and the O'Connor case. And both of those are employment cases. And then there is a case in Williamson County Court, and that is the Hogan case. So maybe we should start with that one to get that one out of the way. This is the case that after Ramsey terminated my ex-husband's employment, they saw him engaging in behavior that they believed violated the non-compete agreement that he had with them. So they filed for a temporary restraining order to keep him from doing that. And this is that case. It was in 2021, but the last filing was in January of 22. So, about 11 months ago. And it's really just been sitting there. So we don't really know what's happening. They could be engaging in discovery.
What are some of the things that stood out to you as you read through the cases?
There were some really interesting quotes, biblical quotes and questions that were asked. So at one point in Jen Sievertson's deposition, and Jen Sievertson is the chief marketing officer of Ramsey, they asked her about Bible verses about throwing stones at people. And she said, I believe there's a story about that. And the attorney asked, do you recall who the stones were being thrown at? I don't recall stones being thrown. I remember there being a reference to stones being thrown. And they asked, do you remember the context? And she said, loosely, yes. They asked, what was it? What do you remember? She said, a woman that was engaged in sexual immorality was being brought before the Pharisees. And they said, okay. And wasn't Jesus involved in that story? She said, yes. They said, didn't he encourage the Pharisees not to throw stones at the woman who was engaging in premarital sex? She said, I believe so. And here's the question. So is Ramsey Solutions more like the Pharisees or the woman? And I think that's a really good question we should consider.
How did she answer?
She said, I never recall having had a discussion about Ramsey Solutions as it relates to that story in the Bible. Maybe they should. Maybe the board should think about that. So that was one quote. Here was another good quote in Mark Floyd's deposition. He was the chief financial officer at the time. And they asked him, well, wasn't Mary, Jesus's mother, unmarried when she conceived with him? And he said, yes, she was. And they said, it's a good thing she didn't work for Ramsey Solutions, huh?
Yeah.
That's fair.
That's fair. Yeah.
Less about Bible stories and more about the culture, or what we see there was in Michael Finney's deposition. Mm-hmm. And I fear for him a little bit because usually if you criticize Dave Ramsey, you could get in trouble. But they asked about emails that Dave Ramsey had said related to a particular situation. And he was responding and he said, my experience with Dave's emails is that sometimes Dave can sound a lot more forceful than what he really means. She said, is Dave lying that Jack should not do what he says he should do? And he said, well, my assumption, again, my opinion is that Dave is just frustrated about the situation. They could just allow it to sit out there as kind of a warning shot across the bow, a threat, don't do this kind of stuff, or it could just quietly go away.
Yeah.
So that's the local case. And then the other two cases are in the Middle District of Tennessee, which is federal court. The first is the Amos case. That was originally filed in Williamson County, and then it was refiled in federal court as an employment action. And that one focuses mainly on the disagreements related to COVID protocols and a gentleman who said, hey, my faith dictates for me to care for my family and to care for my neighbor by wearing a mask and trying to work from home. And, he had relied upon, or it appears that he had relied upon a bunch of promises that Ramsey had made when he took the job from California and moved his family. And so that case, like all these cases, is under a protective order. So it's in the dark at this point with respect to discovery. And I believe there's an outstanding motion to dismiss that has not been ruled on by the court. And what we find is in federal court, they are notoriously slow in ruling on motions because it's just backlogged cases. It's not that they're doing anything wrong. And so that's outstanding. They're doing discovery and depositions. All of that is supposed to be done in February. And dispositive motions, which would be like a motion for summary judgment that could dispose of the case, are due in April. But right now, they're supposed to be engaging in settlement talks. And they engaged in a settlement exchange where Ramsey apparently didn't do what the court had asked them to do, which was to give a counteroffer. So the court, the magistrate, who is kind of the judge that assists with the day-to-day, was not very happy about that and said, you need to go back into this. Within 14 days, Ramsey, you need to make a counteroffer. And then you guys need to engage in mediation by, I think it's March of next year. So maybe that case will settle. We'll see.
Yeah, it's interesting. Now, so their initial counter offer, didn't it include like more threats towards Amos?
That's what the plaintiff alleged, that they didn't make a count. He made an offer of settlement. They did not make a counter offer. And they basically kind of said, hey, if you do X, we're going to sue you, or, you know, something to that effect. So it seems to be a very contentious exchange. The exchanges with the lawyers have been quite contentious.
Yeah.
So yeah, one to watch.
Yeah. And there's one more case, and we've talked about this before, and it has more information out there. It's much more, I don't know, it's bigger. It feels bigger because of all the work that's already been done on it, and all the work that has all the filings that have already happened. And after you and I talked, which was the end of August, close to the end of August, there was a big filing that actually happened with lots of attachments. I don't know how many pages. You could probably tell me how many pages of attachments there were. Hundreds, probably.
There were probably about 1,500 pages, I think.
So, you know, anyone, again, can look at this. It's all out there. But it will take a lot of time. And it takes a little bit of background understanding to be able to connect the dots on all of these things. There are redactions in there that are supposed to protect the identities of people that are not connected to the case. But the ones, you know, some of the redactions are very clearly about you. And so this is an interesting conversation to have. So let's talk about this final case, the O'Connor lawsuit.
Right. If people haven't followed, you and I were deposed last fall.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, part of me hoped, gosh, the trial's going to happen in April and this phase of my life will be done.
Yeah.
Because, you know, it's drug out for a long time. And I had no idea that God would use a case related to a woman I didn't know at all, who got pregnant, to start to reveal and peel back the curtain. But that trial date was canceled because there was, an outstanding motion by Ramsey for summary judgment, which would say, you know, there's no disputed issues of material fact or important facts, and we're entitled to judgment. And that is what really started the ball rolling in terms of the protective order being reduced and pulled back, and things becoming public, which I find a significant irony there.
Yeah. Because of the motion that happened from Ramsey saying, hey, there's nothing here. We agree on that. But the O'Connor side, the plaintiff, is saying, we need to tell you that we don't agree, and we need to show you why. In order to do that, we need to attach some things.
Right. Right. And because of how the nature of the court system, it is supposed to be a public system where people can see what happens and why. And it's not a good thing for things to be shrouded in darkness. It's certainly not biblical.
Yeah.
But it's not faithful to how the United States was built in our Constitution for how things should operate. So there is an irony that it was Ramsey who filed that motion, and then that's what really started the ball rolling for things to become public, which is what they were trying to avoid. And I think we've seen that consistently. But yeah, it's a really strange thing to be so personally affected by a lot of this, but then also as an attorney to look at these cases and then also to personally know the attorneys that are representing Ramsey.
Yeah.
And I just want to say too, you know, attorneys do their work and try to do it faithfully, I believe, especially if they're believers. And I have no ill will towards these attorneys. Their outside attorney, everything I know about her is that she is a good person and a very good attorney. And, you know, I'm sure, my guess is she did not know a lot of this before she waded into this space. And she's, you know, there's not been things that that I would hold against her. Their inside attorney, same situation. I do believe, he should be accountable for the way he handled the cease and desist letters to all of you, just whether he knew, the real basis or not, but it was a very unkind and pretty manipulative letter. So that being said, they're doing their jobs. And I think they're trying to represent their client in the best way that they can, which is our ethical obligation as attorneys.
Yeah.
But there are some interesting things in all of this.
Yeah.
It was hard. It was hard to read and reframe, what I knew was happening in my life and what I knew was happening in my world, what they were telling me at the time, what they were telling me, what my then husband was telling me, but then actually what I now find out they were saying in emails.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things that kind of makes your brain crack, because the inconsistency and just the obfuscation and hypocrisy there is so large that there's just a grief there. Like, I had a lot of grieving. I've had a lot of grieving over the past several years to realize people are not the same people all the time. And that people can use the name of God and the idea of prayer and the idea of supporting people in ways that are so damaging and so deceptive.
Yeah. So as you looked through these attachments that just came out this fall, the really interesting thing is these attachments are depositions, and included in that are copies of emails that were sent. And so these are the words of board members, the words of Dave himself. So this is why it is particularly interesting to the case, and why I think people should pay attention, because this is Dave's own words and his inner circle, their own words about their actions and how they made decisions and how they talked about people.
Right. And like I said, I mean, if we are to behave as if, because God is an all-knowing God, and he is that camera that I was saying theoretically behave in a way that is, if a camera was following us around and reported on everything we did, he already knows all that.
Yeah.
So it is interesting, though, to see the curtain pulled back on some of those things. We'll start off with something that was interesting that made me chuckle. And that is that they're clearly reading and watching or listening to whatever's being put out about this case, as a good lawyer should do.
Yep.
But from the Ramsey filing, defendant's response to plaintiff's motion to seal. So this is where they're arguing all of this stuff should stay sealed, and here's why. And they said, these documents are only at issue because plaintiff has pursued extensive discovery regarding redacted, even going so far as obtaining an affidavit from who maintains an extensive blog regarding this and every lawsuit involving defendant, and regularly discusses defendant on social media. So, yeah.
Who are they talking about?
But what's funny is an extensive blog. I mean, my personal blog has maybe, 5 or 6 articles related to Ramsey, and a gazillion other articles related to lots of other things, like special needs and rare disease and faith. My Medium is, there's 4 updates about cases or whatever, and then about why I'm writing this. But, I've maintained a blog since 2011, and have a book and have lots of other writings, including peer-reviewed research articles. So do I write about this? Yeah, I find it interesting. And
why not? Like, what's right? Like, if there's nothing to hide, why are they worried about somebody writing about it?
Yeah. So I found that quite interesting. But so the themes, there were a lot of themes that you could see that I think we've talked before about some of the themes we see in their cases. So one of the issues, specifically in that filing, was this issue of disclosure. And, their point was, we want to protect third parties by not disclosing this information. And also, they said, from possibly libelous statements. So if they're disclosing things that are their emails and their information, then basically what they're saying is, we possibly committed libel and we don't want it to come out.
That's
And,
crazy.
the thing about libel is, the basis for libel is an untrue statement.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not libel to say something derogatory or things like that. Libel is an untrue statement. So that's saying, hey, we probably said untrue things, or maybe they're saying some of the things that other people put in there were not true. But I definitely know some of the things they said were not true.
Do you think they knew that they were arguing that, or were they trying to argue possibly that somebody would take that and commit libel from seeing the attachments?
No, I think, sometimes you make the best arguments you can.
Okay. Yeah.
And the reality is, in a trial, all of this stuff would come out.
Yeah.
So, I think they were hoping to get this over with before it, became public or became a trial. And so they're saying they want to protect third parties, but meanwhile, their track record is not protecting third parties at all.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So there's a hypocrisy here and a tension. So, they, as we talked about with the Got Your Six meeting, Dave splashed my personal life to 1,000 employees without my consent, and actually lied in how he described it to people. And then actually suggested that somehow I had committed either adultery or some other wrong in my marriage, by saying there's no angels in this story.
Yeah.
And so, they expect people to disclose things to them. So they want you, when you're interviewing, to disclose your budget. They want you to disclose if you're married, which is actually illegal. But in wanting to have a spousal interview, and disclosing a budget, you're disclosing basically if you spend money on medical expenses or childcare, whether or not you're married, what your spouse is like, what, race or gender your spouse is, all of these things. So they want people to disclose things to them. Or if there's an accusation, they want you to disclose your personal information. Who do you live with or not? What sexual activity are you engaging in? They even went so far to say that when asked if somebody was pregnant, and somebody said, well, one of the questions was, well, what if, they engaged in IVF? And they're like, well, we would expect that they would come in and tell us that.
Wow.
And, just the thought of how invasive that is. Or let's say you were raped. Let's say you were raped and you were pregnant. And you should never have to share that with anyone.
Yeah.
That is like trauma-informed practice 101. And the idea that they would expect someone to come in and tell them how they got pregnant, and and expect them to say that, and if they say I'm not telling you, fire that person.
Wow.
Just unbelievable.
Yeah, very invasive.
Right. So, they're saying they want to protect people, but their track record is, exposing people's most personal details and requiring people's most personal details. And, and often standing on stage and talking about somebody's wrongs or lying about.
Talking about their marriages, making up things about people, saying this person married poorly, or telling people, that somebody left because they're working on their marriage, when that is very personal and oftentimes not true.
Often not true.
Yeah.
So that's one thing we see. Another is, we've seen this a lot related to the gossip policy, and the fact that they say, we don't want gossip, and that's biblical. But in reality, what they're labeling gossip is, we don't allow you to talk negatively about Dave or the company or his family or the work here or somebody above you. But meanwhile, they do want you to gossip if you think somebody might have engaged in something. They want you to come tell your boss. Or there's a story in one of the depositions about someone who lived in the same apartment complex as a female employee of Ramsey, and they saw her boyfriend in his boxer shorts walking the dog at 5 a.m. And of course, they ran to their leader, and that woman was fired, by all accounts, at least according to the information. So they want that information. But then again, going on the flip side here, when, and I'll out these things, when my father called the company to say, hey, I thought this was a biblical company. What are you doing here? Dave's perspective on that was that his trying to tattle on my husband was actually worse than having an affair.
And Dave said that in the files, in the stuff that was showed in the filing. Yeah.
Yeah. In an email to other board members, I believe. So, you've got the boxer short boyfriend, that was good. And then that woman was fired. But man, somebody trying to hold your guy accountable, and actually hold your testimony accountable that you have said publicly. Because I'm not actually here to say that I think it's right necessarily that you should be able to have these standards and get into this personal level of detail. But, that's not even why I went to them. I went to them out of courtesy because I thought it was going to become public.
Yeah. And it's the inconsistency, right?
Right.
It's the inconsistency. So you wanted to get ahead of the story to protect them.
And not in a deceitful way. I mean, I was obviously devastated.
Yeah.
It exploded my entire family. Mm-hmm. So another thing that you see, that's not a hypocrisy thing, but something as a sign that people might need therapy, is when you have a pattern of telling people their emotions. If you've been in therapy for 5 minutes, you learn that it's not healthy to tell someone, hey, Amy, you are so angry and you need to stop being that way. Mm-hmm. You can say, I feel like you might be angry with me. But what we see in a lot of these emails is Dave saying that Caitlin O'Connor is scared and embarrassed. Suzanne Sims told me a lot that I was so angry. And frankly, at the time, I was very controlled and in how I was responding, and was not, engaging that emotion at all. So it's really unhealthy to tell somebody else, or try to tell somebody else how you think they're feeling. Mm-hmm. Another interesting insight that I can really relate to is actually a lack of clarity about the righteous living policy. So there were several instances in the discovery where people didn't necessarily realize that there was this bright line about whether it's premarital sex or whatever. And they didn't realize that they were expected to tell this information to Ramsey. So, two kinds of things. Were they clear on
who wouldn't know about the line? And so
that there were employees, that expressed that they didn't really know. Okay. They didn't know necessarily that this was a bright line, premarital sex. And they also didn't know that they were expected to give this kind of personal information to Ramsey.
Sure.
And I can really relate to that because, a very interesting part to read in this was, a really good Darvo. Gotta love a really good Darvo. You want to tell people what Darvo is?
Yes. Oh, so Darvo is, it's an acronym, right? It's DARVO. And it's when somebody comes and says, like somebody that's been hurt, a victim, survivor, they report something, and then that person responds by deny, which is the D, and then they attack, which is the A, and the R is reverse. They reverse the victim and offender. So that's RVO. And so the person that just came to say, I've been hurt, is now being attacked and being told that they are the one that is the problem.
Right. And so then that other person becomes the victim.
Yeah.
So there's a really interesting part in Dave's deposition where he said that, I came to them and was not credible. And because of my behaviors, I'm not sure what behaviors he's talking about other than being very calm and, having actually other people that are in the room that were witnesses and could very much describe how my manner was and the things I said. So he said that, well, we didn't believe her because she wasn't credible. And they were like, well, didn't what she say turn out to all be true? He's like, yeah, but it's a shame really that she wasn't credible. It would have saved us a lot of time.
As if it was your fault.
Me. Yeah.
And he
me.
had no firsthand information from his experience with you personally that would show that you were not credible. The only reason he would have to think that you were not credible is, I am assuming, that he didn't want to believe you're credible. And number two, he was taking the word of this employee of his, your ex-husband, whatever he was saying about you, even though he knew pretty much in real time that Chris had been lying to them and misleading them for a long time. But he decided to, for some reason, believe that even though he was lying about that, he was telling the truth about you.
Yeah. I mean, it takes a lot of suspension of disbelief to relate to the idea that they could defend and believe in a situation where they had ample evidence that, somebody had lied to them for, 10 years and had multiple affairs that they've admitted to. The idea that you would then believe them about something else versus somebody else who, I'm an attorney. I ran a nonprofit. Dave actually knew a lot of this information. He had, engaged with me in that. I had multiple witnesses there.
People
which he actually
wondering.
blamed too. He actually blamed so this goes back to the point. So he said, it's a shame that we couldn't trust her. And then he even goes further and says that I and my then husband and our church deceived them 10 and 8 years prior, when these other affairs happened, that we deceived them. But the reality is, I had no idea at that time, one, that there was this bright line, or two, that it was in any way my obligation to tell them this information. I mean, I wasn't an employee.
Yeah.
And so I had neither did my church or the people, that's bonkers, really.
Yeah. What's interesting there is he's putting the blame on your church for this past behavior and not bringing it up. But what listeners might not know, and what Dave did not mention, was that during the time that he was learning about, like when you came to him that December of 2018, they called your pastor, your church leaders that were walking with you through this. And they told them then, this is not just in the past. These things are happening right now.
Right now. Mm-hmm.
And so Dave was mad about the past things that they hadn't said to him, but he did not want to believe the things that they were telling him were happening in the present, or very recent past, like within months or in the last year. They didn't want to believe that. So I just want to clarify that for employees, former employees, and listeners. If the story you have been told is that Chris was fired in 2021 because they finally realized that they had been misled by him and that they didn't know, and when they finally knew, they fired him, they had an opportunity to know. They were told. And they decided not to believe people that were independent of the whole situation.
Yeah. I mean, 4 people, actually. Pastor, multiple elders
Yeah.
and people. And actually some of these people on the board know them personally
Yeah.
and
Some
know
of
their
these church
character.
leaders that vouched
Yeah.
for what was happening are
Yeah.
close personal friends with one board member that is part of making that decision.
Yeah. And, they watched the lies happen in real time. So
Yeah.
when the meeting started, my husband said one thing, and then as he was confronted, he eventually, so not only with this long period, they watched actually the lies happening to their face and in front of them. So, that is a complete lack of discernment to then trust, that type of information. But I had no sense, even at that point, I don't think, if I had not expected it to go public, would I have felt an obligation to go to them? I mean, I can't say for sure.
Yeah.
But that wasn't the impetus. And it's certainly, I never felt 10 years before that I was somehow supposed to go tell them this information. I mean, I had 3 toddlers and a sick child, and my husband was having affairs. And I mean, that's a lot on your plate.
Yeah. So what else did you see as you were looking at the filings?
Yeah, there's clearly seems to be a double standard in how they handle men and women, and even how they speak about them, especially Dave or especially Dave's quotes in particular, and we found that in the Got Your Six. If people have not gone and listened to the 2-episode series talking about the Got Your Six and playing Dave's own words, and that's what I think, and only God can do that. To use our own words and actions to reveal things, but hopefully to convict us of our own behavior.
Yeah, call us to account. Give us a chance to wake up and change course.
Right. So if they haven't listened to that, I mean, that's, that speech is replete with differing ways speaking about men and women. But this as well, a number of times there were, referrals to women as crazy, or they've got a screw loose, name calling. Obviously he called me a world-class bitch. And, and that was in the motion. They were like, well, that was in a different context. But then in his deposition, they asked him and he goes, oh, that's accurate. So
yeah, he had a chance to say, I shouldn't have said that.
Right.
While he was being deposed, they asked him about this email where they referred to Melissa as a bitch, and he had a chance to say, I shouldn't have said that. And instead he said it was accurate.
Yeah. So, I'm working through the process of forgiveness. I work with my therapist on, because I mean, really everybody is a child of God. Dave is a child of God. And I feel like to hold people to account is actually a loving action, because how can we repent and know the grace of Jesus and the unconditional love if we don't say, oh, what have I done? And reckon with our own sin.
Yeah.
So, but, here are some of the things they said about men and about, my now ex-husband hanging on by a thread. We've got to give grace. A guy that was hurting, a broken guy trying to heal, lying out of shame and fear, a damaged guy, wounded and harmed. The guy was giving he was fired, but he was giving an independent contractor status after that, a different guy. And independent contractors, actually, they don't require them to live by the standards. So that's a nice workaround. So yeah, you just see this real inconsistency. And, as we've talked about, things from the top of an organization filter down and just infect, whether it's, good things or really toxic misogyny, narcissism. And I think we see that. Now, here's another interesting part that we'll have to, this is, it's interesting how sometimes I'm just watching this play out going, it's bonkers, and it's horribly difficult for me and traumatic for me. But because I didn't know, because this is so different than what I was being told. And, it's kind of shocking.
Mhm. Yeah, for like context here, a lot of this, they're using the reason why they're talking about Melissa's situation with her ex-husband is because he is a comparator in this case. And it seems like the plaintiff's lawyer is trying to make the case that there's not been a consistent way in handling these things. And so that's why this was relevant. And so these attachments to this filing were a lot of conversations that were happening on email and depositions about Melissa's situation. And you did not know what was being said until you read it, like internally. This was the
No.
first time. And so it's been a couple months now since it came out. You've had time to process it. But initially, it was devastating. It's
It
devastating to
was.
see people refer to you as a bitch. It's devastating to see, like, oh my goodness, there is a whole smear campaign
Yeah,
against
I
me.
mean, there were
People that I had, that you had trusted. You had no idea, and you had done nothing
no.
at all.
I
So,
mean, there were suggestions of things said in there that can damage my reputation,
mhm,
could, suggest somehow that my law license should be examined,
mhm,
that I'm not operating in a capacity that is, um, I mean, it was just mind blowing,
mhm.
frankly. And, I still have to think and consider how I want to deal with that and respond to that.
Do you think you
But
have legal recourse for yourself?
I've thought about that. As a lawyer, you can't turn off your lawyer brain.
Yeah.
And when this was all going down, that was the last thing from my mind. I was trying to, one, survive, and the greatest thing, help and support my children, and get through this process. So that was the last thing on my mind. I was
Mhm.
dealing with them to the extent I had to, like, get through all of this. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think there are definitely potential legal claims in a lot of areas for me. But, I look at, any kind of legal claim is really traumatic.
Yeah.
And I've been through a lot. My kids have been through a lot. And God has provided for us
Mhm.
and stood by us. And He continues to reveal all of this information,
Yeah.
um, and protect us in a lot of ways. So, yeah, I mean, we have a great lawyer. I mean, Boz Chivijian is an amazing attorney and helps a lot of survivors of different kinds of abuse. And so, yeah, something we talk about.
Yeah. Just an option to consider as you think through like the best thing for your family. And there's no easy answer for sure. So what were some of the depositions that kind of stood out to you? Who was deposed? What new information might be relevant or interesting to those that are kind of following this case?
Yeah, one thing that was really interesting that we're going to watch play out that haven't made sense of yet were emails in October of 2020 that suggest that they were getting ready to fire my ex-husband at that time. I think at that point, they're talking about the fact that they looked at the divorce decree and had realized he was not being truthful. But I mean, that was the pattern.
Mhm.
Um, and so but they didn't end up firing him till March
Yeah, and in between
when,
that filing in October and March, the Religion News Service article came out in January. And there was allegations about Chris in that. And the response from Ramsey was to completely defend him and make it seem like it was absolutely ridiculous that there
yeah,
was anything to that. So imagine this, like in October, they're having this, like some sort of email goes out that really seems to
they had a
indicate
meeting. They had a meeting. They
that
said they
they
had
are
a
at the end,
90-minute meeting. Yeah.
that they are at the end with Chris. Before the Religion News Service article comes out, when and they gather all the employees together. They tell all of these employees, these are baseless allegations. There is nothing here. But they have already been considering firing him or
Right. And this
terminating
had
him.
been really
Well, it
going on
seems
since
like I can't say
2019.
that for sure, but that's what the email seemed to indicate, that they were seriously at the end of the rope with Chris.
Yeah.
And they were willing to tell all their employees, nothing to see here.
Yeah. I mean, it's really mystifying. And
Yeah.
for people who work there, I mean, everybody has to go down. You only see when you see, you
Yeah.
only know when you know.
Yeah.
But it's a rabbit hole for sure of how they navigated from October and that email and apparently that meeting they had with him into January and then finally into March when one of the women that I had told them, several years prior, about that, admitted. And again, I have a lot of compassion for the women that were involved.
Mm-hmm.
Women that knew he was married. So in that sense, I mean, they knew what they were doing. But there's a lot of lying and manipulation that goes into that. And I have compassion for them. And I I hope they have worked through that and found a way to forgive themselves. And yeah.
Yeah.
So there's other interesting things too that through some of these depositions, Dave's is obviously, so I'll just run through some of the nuggets from Dave's deposition. He consistently refers to an employment agreement as if the employees sign an employment agreement. But other depositions are very careful to say it's not an employment agreement. And I think
do they say
legally
it's not an agreement, or do they say it's not a contract?
Well, an agreement is a contract.
Okay.
So it's very interesting that he doesn't seem to grasp that legal nuance of that. He also refers to normative Christian beliefs.
Normative what?
Normative Christian beliefs.
Okay.
As the basis for what their standards are. When, normative, the whole concept of a norm is, an average or calculation based on an entire population. And if you look and say that what Christians believe over time has changed, then that means the norm changes.
Yeah.
So that's a fascinating thing. What's interesting also is that he answers that they would fire a habitual liar.
Okay.
He says, it violates common sense to keep people that you can't trust.
All right.
And so I'm like, I'm trying to reconcile that. Because, the Bible isn't just about sex, which shockingly, it isn't just about premarital sex. It's about a lot of things, a huge one being lying and deceiving people and, bullying people with your beliefs, which were the Pharisees. And they at Ramsey seems to really zero in on that sex part.
I thought this would be a good time to clarify for you that although Melissa did bring to them her concerns about their marriage in regards to Chris's numerous occasions of infidelity, that wasn't the most serious things that she brought to them. She also shared some more very serious personal family things that were happening that should have alarmed Ramsey, and they dismissed it.
First to flirting as a minor violation of the righteous living policy, in the context of this situation with the woman who came forward at the end. They knew enough in 2018 that any reasonable person would have said, oh, this is not good. And this is probably an affair.
Yeah.
Which is actually what I said to them. I believe it. They might be.
Yeah.
So that goes to that issue of the investigation, right? We've talked before about, what to them is an investigation. And they say over and over in these depositions, our investigation is to ask the people if they've done the thing.
That's not an investigation, in case anybody wonders.
That's not an
That's not an
investigation.
investigation.
Um, so, it's not shocking at all that 3 years later, they would have to sit with the fact that everything I had said was true, because every indicator they had at the time, anybody using a reasonableness standard or discernment about who's telling the truth and who isn't, and what this level of flirting of like, I wake up in the morning and have to call you and think about you, and that's not even like flirting. That's involvement in
Yeah.
a relationship.
Yeah. So
Um,
I don't remember if this was in one of these attachments or if it was somebody that told us. Did somebody said something about them saying that they investigated by looking at social media? They looked at somebody's social media or somebody's phone.
I think they may have looked at his phone, but actually
He had gotten rid of his phone. Do you remember that? So I don't
he
know what
did.
they looked at because,
Well, there was a personal phone and a work phone.
yeah,
And part of how I knew what I knew was from looking at the phone.
yeah.
So
But it wasn't just a
I,
physical phone.
right, it was phone records.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I'm a better HR investigator than they are. I don't know.
If
But
you look at
and
their
I
phone
had
records, you can see, even if people have
patterns.
deleted things on their phones, you can see when calls are happening and texts
Mhm.
are happening. And if they're a pattern of like always happening like late at
Mhm.
night or, that and to the same person, you can see you can see
Yeah,
the
I
number
mean,
of the person.
and as someone that it on multiple periods in my life had to, I mean, that was really one of the big signs were phone records for
Mm-hmm.
me. That's how I put things together on multiple occasions in my marriage, were patterns in phone records.
Yeah.
And one number texting or calling, and then timing. Now people having affairs can hide it better, and he later learned to hide it better with burner phones and things like that. But these were even basic things that Ramsey could have done, and I actually had a ton of evidence that they did not ask for.
In their investigation that they said they investigated, did they ask you anything after you went to them?
Dave asked me about one thing. He asked me if I had a recording of my husband admitting to an act of oral sex. That was the only thing he asked for. And I said, I don't know.
Hmm.
But I mean, I actually had a lot of recordings, lots of papers, lots of documents, phone records, tons of things. But, you know, uh, why would I volunteer that to an employer?
Mm-hmm.
I would have thought that they would have used discernment to be able to look at a situation and clearly see what the truth was.
Yeah.
But another thing that they did not like is challenging them in any way, not going along. I actually in the meetings, very meekly, because I was sitting there praying my heart out because it was so difficult. I'm the speaking out here now. I have these other people, but I have all these people with power and influence over our income and all this stuff. And for me to say something and say, hey, I think what you did here was not right. And at one point I told Dave that something he proposed saying was not, that it was deceptive to say that.
Mm-hmm.
Oh man, that did not go over well. So then I looked at Suzanne's deposition. One of the things she said was I offered no proof of the things I was talking about, although they said they believed me at the time. I mean, I had a ton of proof. She said there was no indication that the affair with this fellow employee at the time was happening. And I want to say, other than 2 other affairs and 10 years of lying,
Yeah.
and other
And
really
the
serious,
leaders from your church
right?
saying this is happening, and he's admitted it.
So the lack of discernment there is just it's putting your head in the sand really to justify not losing money.
Yeah.
And, she talked about the investigation involved questioning him, and they asked about affairs. She said, the only three we've been made privy to.
Only three. Oh my word.
I just had to chuckle. So another interesting thing was, in my divorce action, one of the things that I did was to subpoena certain things from Ramsey that I knew should exist there. Because in Tennessee is a fault state for divorce. Unless you come to some kind of an agreement, you have to prove fault. So you have to prove adultery or things like that. And so that had existed, but he was saying, oh, I was trying to get him fired. So I wanted actual, like, here's actually what happened. So I'd asked for the recordings of these meetings that we knew existed. And I'd asked for notes that were taken at the meetings, because I saw people taking notes.
Yeah.
And, their response to the judge was, no, these things don't exist. That the Got Your Six meeting recording didn't exist, that notes from these meetings didn't exist. We actually knew they existed because they were on the central intranet.
Not
at the
notes,
time,
but the recordings of the
recordings.
meetings. Yeah, they were there.
There were 2 depositions in which people admitted taking notes. And so, Jen Sievertson and Armando, who runs the HR, admitted that they had notes related to things related to my marriage, or he had a call from my father that he had taken notes.
But their Ramsey lawyer told the judge in the case for your divorce that they didn't have any of those things. They didn't do any of those things.
So, I mean, that's obviously seriously problematic.
And that is documented. That court hearing where they said that is, we have that transcript of that hearing.
Yeah, that's public.
We could put that next to the emails where they talk about having notes. That's so crazy.
Yeah, it was actually in depositions, in Jen Sievertson's and Armando's deposition. Now, in contrast to Jen Sievertson and Armando admitting they had taken notes about some of this stuff, when asked about taking notes in some of these meetings, Mark Floyd, who was the CFO, said, oh, well, this isn't like a board of directors, so we don't have minutes, but often I take notes. But then he said, well, but when we talk about more of the sensitive stuff, and I'm paraphrasing here, when we talk about more of the sensitive stuff, no one takes notes for that.
That sounds like an agreed upon thing. It sounds like, how is it just random that everyone didn't take notes? They would have had to decide this somehow together. We're not going to write this down. And it's
actually the opposite of what you should do, because when you are I'm not an HR specialist, but I'm an attorney.
You should document everything.
When you are handling something that is very sensitive, actually you want to follow careful procedures. And but the issue is, it sounds like they don't really have procedures for how they do this. So in some ways, that was probably a smarter, because they do want to hide things and try to hide all the emails. And so if there were notes, it probably would say things that could be illegal, or would prop up that they'd had incorrect or illegal motives for different things. So maybe that's the reason they don't take notes about sensitive information. But it certainly isn't something that I think a good HR person would advise.
Yeah. What is the next step, and what do we think is happening? What seems to be happening next with this case? We don't have a date for the trial yet, which is interesting. We're waiting on a ruling on Ramsey's motion for summary judgment. Is that the next thing that's going to happen?
So in the O'Connor case, the seal has come off a lot of the documents. And at this point, Ramsey has filed a motion for summary judgment. The O'Connor team has responded to that. So we're waiting for the judge to rule on that. And she has multiple claims. So it's possible that the judge could say, well, this claim is dismissed, but this claim is not, or, it's completely denied. So we're waiting on a ruling on that motion. And then what it appears is they're going to set it for trial.
Yeah.
after that. And, between now and then there could be, settlement discussions and things like that. And it's hard to know when the court might set it for trial because, the Amos case is set for trial next October.
Mhm.
So part of you might say, oh, well, it would be after that since that one's already set. But, trials get canceled
Mhm.
like this one. And, generally they wouldn't want it to just sit out there with nothing happening for an extended period of time. So it could be that they could set
And the
it sooner.
discovery has already happened. So
Right.
it's not like they have to wait for that to happen.
Right. And in theory, the attorneys should be ready for trial because it was supposed to go to trial in April.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so those are the two big things that are going to happen there. And yeah, we'll see.